Welcome back to another AP video lecture. Today, we're going to be talking about the Borderlands. Okay, sounds like kind of a weird movie for like sci-fi movies, right? But actually, the Borderlands are really important. Here's why. Let's start off here, actually outside of the Borderlands. We're going to start off with the hegemonic powers. Okay, what do I mean by that? A hegemonic power was a country or empire that had dominance in all areas in a particular region. So they had dominance in military, politics, economics, and probably most importantly, culture. A good example for the time we're talking about is China. China in East Asia had dominance, and they had dominance not only in military, but they also had dominance in their culture. They passed off ideas to other cultures about merit-based exams, about Confucianism and filial piety. They had power when it came to their overall organization with bureaucracy and how they organized their economy. This had a huge influence in areas that weren't so organized, areas right next to them that were going to be heavily influenced by their culture. This happened during the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties in China. So here's my overall argument that I want to make that's really important to this time period that we shouldn't forget. Hegemonic powers had this dominance in the region, and borderlands were decentralized and fragmented, so they were influenced by these regions. So what was important for them was they wanted to maintain their own identity, and they kept fighting to maintain their own identity. Okay, so now we're going to do a few case studies. The first one has to do with the country of Korea. During this time period, Korea had three dynasties, the Sia, the Joseon, and the Goryeo. These three dynasties had been at times conquered or heavily influenced by China, and eventually China established what was called a tributary relationship. Now, what does that mean? These countries would pay a tax once a year in China, not in money, not in currency, but in food production. And the purpose of the tax was not so China could get more food. The purpose was to show their dominance. When Korea paid that tax, they were essentially saying, China, you're in control. Now, at the local level, then, what did Korea do to maintain its identity? Well, a few different things. First off, they did adopt some of the ideas from China, ideas like the civil service exam, merit-based ideas, the ideas of filial piety. But at the same time, they tried to maintain their identity by creating some of their own culture. For example, they created their own language called Hangul. They did not try to just have Chinese culture alone. Now, the Korean aristocracy overall tried to also not only maintain its identity from China, but also maintain its power from within. So they oftentimes put down local people. How did they do that? Well, they did have that new language, Hangul, but they also adopted the Chinese language of Mandarin. And they acted like, hey, we can speak Mandarin because we're kind of above everybody else, right? So that allowed them to distinguish themselves from local peasants. The other thing that happened too was the treatment of women. Before China had a huge influence, Korean women had a lot of power. But once China came in and had their influence of filial piety, the aristocracy used that in order to sort of put women back into what's called the domestic sphere, that private sphere of the home. In other words, this became rather oppressive towards women. Okay, case study number 2, Vietnam, which was actually really different in what happened. So initially, the Han dynasty, from long before in China, had taken over Vietnam, and two sisters rose up in rebellion called the Trang sisters. They kicked out China for a brief period of time, but then China came back with the Sui dynasty and took over again. Now, Vietnam was always able to maintain somewhat independence, and China basically from Vietnam was looking for, you got it, champa rice, that rice that they found that could grow in really dry climates. What Vietnam tried to do throughout this, though, was to maintain their cultural identity. How did they do this? Well, at the local level, they did things like cockfighting and chewing betel nuts. I know, you're just like, really? What does that have to do anything, right? Because by doing that, they were basically saying that they have their own cultural practices. The Chinese oftentimes looked at that and said, you guys are kind of primitive. Look at what you're doing. You're barbaric. And the Vietnamese basically acted like, no, this is a part of our culture. And by doing that, they were taking these basic kind of practices and making it a part of their own identity. Think of in your family, the foods you eat, right? They're not just foods, they're a way for you to identify as that's a part of your family, it's a part of your culture. The other thing in Vietnam that was different from Korea is that Vietnamese women maintained power, they maintained independence. They actually had a lot more power in the local area, and they didn't adopt a lot of Chinese filial piety to put women into a specific space. Okay, let's take case study number 3, Japan. Japan's really interesting because it's this island and they're constantly trying to resist Chinese influence. But at the same time, they bring in some of China's ideas. Now, Japan was always fragmented. It didn't really have a centralized power. I know. You're like, that's not true. I've seen Japanese anime. I know that there's an emperor in Japan. And you're right. There was an emperor in Japan. There was the emperor. The emperor then eventually established what was called the shogunate, which was a military rule over Japan. Then there were local, what was called daimyo, or governor. And those governors would hire out for samurai. Now, these local daimyos or governors actually had the most amount of power. It wasn't the emperor who had all the power. So Japan remained fragmented. But Japan did bring in ideas from China. They adopted ideas like Confucianism and filial piety, merit-based exams. They adopted also Buddhism and Confucianism and mixed it with Japanese religion. So the Japanese believed in natural spirits called the kami. They put all this stuff together, they mixed it up, and they came up with their own religion that they still have today called Shintoism. Now, in Japan, another thing happened too for women. We've been talking a lot about that here. There was a book written at the time called The Tale of Ganji. It was written by a woman in Japan, and she made the argument that women oftentimes were used by local clans inside of the courts in order to create alliances between different people. What is all this saying? Japan adopted a lot of ideas from China, but because it was an island, also attempted to maintain its own identity, its own independence. Okay, last off is Europe. When we think of Europe, we tend to think today, Europe, North America, a lot of power, leadership in the world, right? Not at this time. After 496 CE, Europe falls apart. The Roman Empire is conquered and everything kind of falls into chaos. Along comes a French king named Charlemagne, and he tries to rebuild it. It's what was called the Treaty of Verdun. The Treaty of Verdun, he tried to create a new Holy Roman Empire with the Catholic Church at its center in Italy. Didn't work out all that well. In fact, what ended up happening was a hot mess in Europe that would last for centuries. Basically, local kingdoms fighting amongst each other and not really creating centralized control. In these kingdoms, too, there were kings, but they didn't have a whole lot of power. The real power was located in feudalism. What is feudalism? Feudalism was a hierarchy in which you would have landowners who were called lords, and then you had peasants who worked for them. And the peasants were tied to the land, meaning they couldn't just roam about and do whatever they wanted to do. And that meant that things were really at the local level. They were decentralized. Now, there were examples where Europe was able to organize itself. Down near the Mediterranean Sea, there was a trade confederation called the Hanseatic League, and they did organize a little bit. But overall, Europe was not all that organized, and it remained that way for some time. Why does it matter? Because Europe was constantly being influenced by powers outside of itself. In fact, it was really terrified of Islamic empires coming in and conquering Europe at the time. This would remain Europe's biggest problem for a long time. It eventually became Europe's biggest strength when these kingdoms would compete against each other as they went out and explored different lands. Okay, so what are our big takeaways from this video lecture? Number one, at this time period, the centralized kingdoms and empires of the world, places like China, the Middle East, India, and Africa, had the most amount of power. They were known as the hegemonic powers. Number two, local areas that were called the borderlands, right around these areas, they were decentralized and fragmented. They were influenced by these hegemonic powers. Number three, they may have been influenced, but all these areas, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Europe, all tried to maintain their local independence. How do they do this? By creating their own languages, by creating their own ways of doing relationships, by creating their own basic practices. This is going to be important throughout world history because we're going to see this process reverse later on when America and Europe start taking over places and other areas of the world try to maintain their identity later on in world history. Okay, I'll see you in class.